In part 3 of this series on shorebird plumage and molt, we'll be looking at juvenile plumage, with a particular focus on migratory shorebirds which occur in Malaysia. There are links to parts 1 and 2 in the comments below this video. The learning outcomes for this video are that you will understand some of the characteristics of juvenile plumage, and that you'll then be able to identify juvenile plumage in a variety of species in the field. So here's an outline of what we will be covering. We'll start by looking at some characteristics of juvenile plumage in all shorebirds. Then we'll look at the best times of year to observe shorebirds in juvenile plumage, especially migratory ones. Next, we'll cover some characteristics of juvenile plumage appearance in selected shorebird families and species. And finally, we'll look at how wear affects juvenile plumage appearance. So firstly then, some characteristics of juvenile plumage. Firstly, it is the first set of feathers which a bird has after natal down. So shorebirds, when they are hatched, they are covered in down, their eyes are open, they're able to forage and run within hours of hatching. But the first set of proper feathers is termed juvenile plumage, and it's attained by a complete pre-juvenile or first pre-basic molt. And at 3 weeks already on this Malaysian plover, we can see the feathers beginning to grow. Notice also that they are growing at the same time. So for the only time in the bird's life cycle, its feathers will all be the same age. Also, they are very fast growing. The period between hatching and flight is an extremely vulnerable one for shorebirds, even though they can run and they can hide, but still they are most vulnerable to predation in this time between hatching and being able to fly. So the attainment of the first set of feathers via a complete molt is a rapid process. This Malaysian plover was capable of sustained flight by 6 to 7 weeks after hatching. But the cost of this rapid growth is that the feathers are relatively weak and not as long-lasting as those of adult basic plumage, and also the feathers are smaller in size, particularly the scapulars and wing coverts. So this is a trade-off. In order to grow this set of feathers fast, they're not particularly strong and they're not particularly large. So here, that's some basic characteristics of juvenile plumage. Moving on, when can we see juvenile plumage, especially when we're talking about migratory shorebirds? Of course, non-migratory shorebirds may breed at any time of year when the conditions are suitable, and so we can see juvenile birds like red-wattled lapwing, Malaysian plover, black-winged stilt, and so on, pretty much at any time of year. But in terms of the birds the species which migrate from the northern hemisphere, we generally see them about 2 to 3 weeks after the arrival of the first adults as they migrate southwards. And generally speaking, juvenile plumage can only be seen between the months of July at the earliest and November at the latest. And by then, and earlier, preformative molt begins. Preformative molt can begin soon after arrival, or it can already be underway before the birds arrive in Malaysia. And we can actually see on this juvenile sanderling here that it has already begun preformative molt. 2 of the scapulars there are in formative plumage feathers. So this bird has already begun molting even in the 3rd week or 2nd week of September. And it's worth bearing in mind that some species don't arrive in Malaysia until they've actually completed preformative molt. And that means we may never see, or it may be very rare to see, juveniles of certain species. For example, I have never seen a juvenile Nordmann's greenshank in Malaysia. By the time they arrive here, they're already in full, they've already completed their preformative molt, and so they're in formative plumage by the time they arrive. And the same may also be true of common greenshank. It is unusual to see a fully juvenile common greenshank in Malaysia. I look back over my records, which I've kept since 2006, just to get an idea of when you might expect to see juveniles turning up in Malaysia. Now, I've written this as my personal earliest recorded dates of first calendar year shorebirds, because some of them have already completed preformative molt, and so they're not really technically juveniles anymore. But let's just look at them. So the earliest I've seen a juvenile of any migratory species is the 18th of July, common redshank, which is always tends to be the earliest to arrive. So remember that we're talking about juveniles here. So again, 2 to 3 weeks after adults first turn up, we begin to see the first juveniles. So common redshank by mid to end July, the sand plovers by early August, as well as common sandpiper, marsh sandpiper, Eurasian curlew, curlew sandpiper, Asian dowager, whimbrel, pteric sandpiper, broad-billed sandpiper, blacktail, godwit, little stint, long-toed stint, wood sandpiper, redneck stint, and ruddy turnstone, all by the end of August. Those are my earliest ever dates. So my earliest ever record of juveniles of those species have been in August. My earliest ever juveniles of Pacific golden plover, common greenshank, sanderling, Kentish plover, great knot, grey-tailed tattler, red knot have not been until September, and my earliest ever juvenile redneck phalarope, Siberian sandplover, grey-headed lapwing have not been until October. And latest of all, I have only seen juvenile common snipe, pintailed snipe, and grey plover, or at least first calendar year birds, in November, which is very late for the birds still to be showing extensive juvenile plumage. So maybe this is a challenge for you. I'm sure that we can beat some of these dates, and sometimes the fact that they're late dates is more a reflection of the fact that they are a scarce species that I don't see very often. But I'm pretty sure that, especially for some of the commoner species, my first dates over the last 17 years or so are fairly reliable. Next, what does juvenile plumage look like? Well, I mentioned already that pre-juvenile molt is rapid, and therefore the feathers of juvenile plumage are all the same age. And this is the only time in the bird's life when this is so. Also, because juvenile feathers, especially the scapulars and coverts, are slightly smaller than adults, as I mentioned, they seem to fit better onto the bird. And so juvenile feathers are all the same age, they look neat, and they form even rows. They don't seem to be kind of having to squeeze in to fit, as you can see on this beautiful, fresh juvenile sanderling. Another difference, and this is really only visible on sharp, good quality photographs of birds in flight mostly, is that juvenile flight feathers are a different shape from adult flight feathers. So on the left here we have a first calendar year redneck stint, which still has juvenile flight feathers, primaries, secondaries, and tail feathers. And on the right, there's an adult redneck stint. And if we look carefully and closely at the tail here, we can see that the juvenile tail feathers are narrower and more pointed than the adult tail feathers. Quite clearly there's a difference there. And again, if we look at the primaries, we can see the same thing. The juvenile has slightly narrower and more pointed primaries than the adults. So that's a consistent difference between juveniles and adults across not just shorebirds, but as far as I'm aware, pretty much all species, all kinds of birds. Another feature of juvenile plumage is that the upper parts are often distinctively patterned when they're fresh, and as I mentioned already, they look neat, and as you can see, there's beautiful neat rows of wing coverts on this juvenile Tibetan sand plover. So the Anahincus plovers, the new genus given to the sand plovers, generally speaking, I can say they have broad barfish or pale fringes to the upper part feathers. And in fresh plumage, they often have a sort of peachy wash to the breast, which makes some people think that they're adults in breeding plumage, which of course they're not. Moving on to the streaky or the pluvialis plovers, the Pacific golden plover and the grey plover, in juvenile plumage they have lots of neat spots, often a spot each side of the shaft of the scapulars and the wing coverts, and lots of notches along the tertials, these triangular pale spots, and also on the breast these very fine streaks. So very neat, again, you can see how all the wing coverts just fit together nicely, the scapulars, the mantle, they form these beautiful complex patterns which you don't generally see on adults. Curlews and whimbrels are somewhat similar to pluvialis plovers in that their juveniles have similar triangular spots on the upper parts, the wing coverts, the scapulars, the tertials, and fine streaks on the underparts, especially on the breast. Black-tailed godwits in juvenile plumage and several other species, a characteristic of some juveniles is that they have dark subterminal spots on the wing coverts and scapulars. Sometimes we call them anchor shaped, sometimes they're diamond shaped, sometimes they're sort of arrow shaped following the feather shaft. So this bird has already begun preformative molt. You can see some of the scapulars are plain grey feathers without patterning, but we can still see a number of the scapulars and all the wing coverts and tertials are juvenile feathers. This is a juvenile pin-tailed snipe, and snipe in juvenile plumage have dark subterminal and pale subterminal fringes on the coverts. So if you can look carefully at the wing coverts on this snipe, you have these neat double fringes on each feather that follows the contour of the feather, whereas on the adults they would be more barred straight across the feather. Here's a common sandpiper juvenile, and these have quite a complex pattern. They have multiple dark and pale inner bars on the coverts. Now adults have bars on the coverts, so it's the fact that they have more than one of each on the coverts that makes this distinctively juvenile. And also, of course, the general neatness and freshness of every single feather on the bird. Looking at Tringa sandpipers, like this juvenile marsh sandpiper, Tringa sandpipers generally have dark-centered, pale-edged coverts and scapulars and pale notches along the tertials. And again, if you look carefully at this marsh sandpiper, you can see a couple of scapulars have already been molted and are in formative plumage, those pale grey feathers. So just going through a few Tringa species, here is a juvenile common redshank, again with this very delicate, intricate pattern of pale and dark and notches along the tertials. Here is a wood sandpiper, sort of variations on a theme. Something I may also just mention is that tertials on juvenile shorebirds are quite often slightly shorter than on adults, and as a result there appears to be more of a primary projection. You can see on this bird about three primary tips that extend beyond the tertials, which might be less in an adult, and that's just worth bearing in mind, especially if you're looking for species that have a longer primary projection, such as American golden plover. When we see juvenile Pacific golden plovers with a apparently long primary projection, that's actually an effect caused by the fact that the tertials are shorter than on the adults. Moving on to the calidris sandpipers. Calidris sandpipers, such as this juvenile curlew sandpiper, often have dark centered scapulars and coverts with pale edges, pale tips, pale fringes, sometimes with internal anchors, darker anchor marks, sometimes diamond shapes, and in fresh plumage they can appear quite richly colored. So for example, this redneck stint very typically has bright chestnut edges to the scapulars, at least the lower scapulars, and then these very dull grey-brown edges to the wing coverts. And that contrast between the bright scapulars and the dull wing coverts of the juvenile redneck stint is one of the things that helps you to distinguish it from a juvenile little stint. Here is a juvenile long-toed stint, and again in fresh plumage, this lovely rich chestnut on the scapulars, which is very distinctive of juveniles. And lastly, here is a juvenile broad-billed sandpiper, and once again similar types of patterning. The actual coloration of individuals may vary. Some may be brighter than others, especially the tertials. You may see some birds have much brighter chestnut fringes and the scapulars, but the actual patterning is pretty consistent. So lastly, I want to answer the question, or address the question, how does wear affect juvenile plumage? So going back to the example of the Malaysian plover again, and I followed this particular bird from hatching, so I was able to track it and also know roughly within a day how old it was. And so here is a bird in fresh juvenile plumage, and I mentioned at the beginning that one of the characteristics of juvenile feathers, especially the scapulars and the wing coverts, which have paler edges, wear away very quickly, and because of that, preformative molt happens quite quickly after the juvenile feathers are grown. So here is the bird at 7 weeks, and here is, I'm very sure, is the same individual at 14 weeks. So let's zoom in on the wings and scapulars of this bird, one at 7 weeks and one at 14 weeks. So at 7 weeks we can see this lovely fresh juvenile plumage. The tertials all have neat contrasting pale fringes. The wing coverts and the scapulars are all evenly aged, showing moderate amount of wear already at just 7 weeks, but nevertheless all similar age and relatively fresh. What we can see just 7 weeks later is that the tertials have pretty much disintegrated, especially the upper tertial, and the wing coverts have become very worn. In fact, a whole row of lesser coverts has dropped, and some of the inner median coverts have also dropped, and that exposes the bases of the greater coverts here, which are white. If you can remember back to when we were looking at feathers, we said that the bases of feathers are often white. They're not exposed to sunlight, so there's no need for them to have melanins. And so what happens when the upper feathers drop out is that these white areas of the base of the feathers are exposed. And so this bird has already begun to molt into formative plumage, and these scapulars, if you compare them with the scapulars in the photograph at the top, are significantly fresher and larger, and notwithstanding the different lighting conditions of the day, I think they're also slightly different color. But certainly if you compare the condition of those scapulars with the condition of the coverts, you can see that they're significantly fresher. So as you can see, full juvenile plumage doesn't last very long. However, some juvenile feathers do last a long time, and we will come back to that in future videos. In particular, the flight feathers of most species of shorebird last for a full year until the bird is ready for its pre-basic molt in its second year. Okay, let's just look at a few other species, and just looking at the effect of wear. So on the left here, a fresh juvenile plumage Tibetan sandplover, and on the right here, a worn juvenile plumage Tibetan sand plover. So what we can see here is that the pale edges, especially on the scapulars, have worn off on the bird on the right, and also on the underparts, the peach-colored tips of the breast feathers have worn away or maybe bleached, and now the bird appears to have a white breast. The bird has not actually begun, or at least it has not begun to molt its underpart feathers. What we can see is on both these birds there are some fresh formative scapulars. So the birds have both begun preformative molt. Note that we cannot always predict the degree of wear on birds based on a given date. And this is because there are too many variables to take into account. For example, these two birds, we don't know when they were hatched. One bird could have been hatched in a first brood. One bird could have come from a second brood. So even if these two photographs were taken on the same date, we couldn't therefore conclude that they are the same age. The second factor is that every individual bird will face different environmental conditions, which will have differential effects on their feathers. So some birds may have extremely worn feathers, other birds may have extremely fresh feathers, depending on the amount of adverse environmental conditions they've had to face. Here are an example of fresh juvenile plumage Pacific golden plover and a worn juvenile plumage Pacific golden plover. The right-hand bird may have begun preformative molt. I think some of the mantle and maybe upper scapulars and a row of about 5 feathers on the flanks may be formative, but it's hard to be sure because this bird was wet, it was raining. I mentioned earlier about the shorter tertials of juveniles, and here we can see on both these birds that the primaries are clearly visible beyond the tertials, but that does not mean that these are American golden plovers, it just means they're juvenile Pacific golden. Another example, the sandling, which we saw earlier in fresh plumage on the 19th of September, in worn juvenile plumage on the 14th of November. Similar stage of molt actually. Both birds have molted just a few scapulars at the rear, you can see on the right hand bird. So most of the difference in appearance here is due to wear, and we can see how wear makes the bird on the right look relatively dull, relatively dark. There's a loss of contrast, and especially the coverts look rather plain and unpatterned compared to the bird on the left. And lastly, here are 2 juvenile redshanks. One, the one we saw earlier in fresh plumage on the 24th of August, and another one in worn plumage on the 19th of September. Now, juveniles of a single species, I mentioned this earlier, may be quite variable in colour, and sometimes, especially in the case of redshanks, in patterns. So the bird on the right perhaps never looked exactly like the bird on the left. Nevertheless, the overall effect of wear, as you can see, is to make the plumage of the worn juvenile duller, more uniform, and darker. We can still age it as a juvenile because if we look closely, the feathers do retain some vestiges of juvenile pattern. They are all exactly the same age. They're all the same degree of wear. There are no fresher wing coverts in amongst them. So also with redshanks, juveniles tend to have less bright bare part colors, which is another giveaway. So the fact that the bill base is pinkish, the legs are a bit washed out, gives us another clue as to the age of these birds. So, juvenile plumage. Let's just recap what we've learned. Firstly, juvenile feathers are uniformly aged, so they look neat. They are often distinctively patterned, and they wear away, or at least the edges of the pale areas wear away much quicker than the equivalent adult feathers. In migratory species, juvenile plumage may be seen in Malaysia from July to November, and that's fairly true of other countries at similar latitudes. juvenile body feathers wear away quickly and so are replaced within months by preformative molt. And we'll look at that in the next video. And lastly, we saw how wear and bleaching, the damage to feathers, can dramatically change the appearance of juvenile feathers, of juvenile plumage. So that's juvenile plumage. As I mentioned, in the following video we will look at preformative molt and formative plumage. But for now, that's all.